aboard. It is episode 101 of the J.R. Hef Show, and I am really grateful today to have John Hood, author of Mountain Folk. It is a fantastic book. John, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So let's talk a little bit about who you are before we get into it. I'm going to read your bio from the website. It says John Hood is a newspaper columnist, historian, and foundation executive with a deep passion for both the American founding and speculative fiction. The author of critically acclaimed books of economic and political history, Hood has reported on governments from town councils to Congress and written for the Wall Street Journal, Military History, and dozens of other publications. A frequent TV and radio commentator and winner of the 2016 Book Award from the North Carolina Society of Historians, Hood teaches public policy to Duke University graduate students and tap dancing to tweens and teens. He received his BA in journalism from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and his Master's of Arts in Liberal Studies from the UNC Greensboro. Again, John, it's great to have you here. I've had a chance to read a little bit of the book already, first couple chapters, watch the series of videos that you did to promote the book, and this just seems really exciting. But boy, it's coming at you from all angles. I don't know if this is a fantasy book, if this is a history book, if this is alternative history. How would you describe the genre of this book?
Well, it is a kind of a mashup. You remember the old commercial about Reese's peanut butter cups? You've got chocolate, you've got peanut butter, two great tastes. They taste great together. Now, I certainly hope that Mountain Folk is not a collision. I mean, that's what the Reese's peanut butter commercials typically, somebody running into somebody else accidentally. I didn't do this accidentally. I've always loved history ever since I was a kid, and I've always enjoyed speculative fiction, particularly epic fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, things like that, as well as science fiction. Dune is a big fan of. I've been a big fan of Dune since I was a kid. So I like both of those things. And I wrote a lot of history in my life, starting out as a journalist and then transitioning into a political historian and among other things. So I had a lot of interest in history. And then I had this avocation of dabbling in speculative fiction, more or less playing the games and being a fan, and having this sort of odd idea in my head, but never really deciding to do anything about it. And what actually happened right after Christmas 2019 is that I got sick. I got very sick. Now, the timing is suspicious. I don't actually think it was COVID. My symptoms were different, but I was sick, and I'm not someone who usually gets sick. And I'm pretty active, as the bio that you read suggests. Some of that bio is actually true. So I was pretty active. I was bored. To do something. I was stuck in bed. So I had long had this weird image in my head. And really, honestly, it was just an image of a young Daniel Boone and his family immigrating from where he was born, which was Pennsylvania, immigrating down the Great Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley into North Carolina, where he goes on top of a mountain and goes hunting and encounters a fairy and a monster. I had this idea in my head, and that's a weird idea, you got to admit. I didn't really know what to do with it. So here I am, ill and kind of bored. And so I decided I would just write the idea down as a short story. I had previously written 7 books. And after the 7th book, which was a political biography, my wife said, "Very good job. I really appreciate that. No more books." And I said, "Oh, but there's these great ideas." And for years, I would throw out idea, you know what would make a really good book? And she would say, "You're right. Find someone else to write it. No more book." So I was under a no book restriction. So I wrote this as a short story, basically for my wife's amusement and my twin brother's amusement. Sent it to my twin brother, printed it out for my wife, and went back to bed. And about an hour later, my wife comes in, looks at me kind of funny and says, "Where's chapter 2?" So the judge had modified her order. Apparently, I was not allowed to write any more nonfiction books, but I could write fiction books because that's just making things up, at which point I went and wrote a very heavily researched historical novel that has lots and lots of detail, probably the most research I've ever done for any book. So I wouldn't say I outsmarted Judge Hood, but I did my thing. And so what I found as I wrote this story, because originally, as I just suggested, it was largely for fun. Mm-hmm. But as I got into it more, I realized that lots of people have learned lots of things that they know about the world by reading about other worlds.
Right.
I mentioned C.S. Lewis. Lots of people, lots of young people read the Chronicles of Narnia or his space series, and led them to some more deeper theological realizations, or at least deeper reading. Mm-hmm. Lots of people read Lord of the Rings just as an adventure tale, but came away learning about the temptations of power.
Right.
Which is really what the Lord of the Rings is about. To be a little more explicitly political, lots of young people read Ayn Rand and sort of learned their first lessons about individual liberty and individualism by reading something like Atlas Shrugged, which is a kind of a science fiction novel, or Anthem, which really was a science fiction novel. Robert Heinlein, famous libertarian writer, many people encountered their first ideas about government and freedom not by reading a textbook or reading a philosophy tract, but by reading The Moon is a Harsh Mistress or other kinds of stories. So I think,
absolutely,
I could do something similar to that perhaps with this book. And so that's what I tried to do. It's an adventure tale, first and foremost, and exciting, and it blends together historical characters like a Daniel Boone or a George Washington with characters that I have invented, though they're based on real folklore, which is kind of a weird way to put it. What I'm saying is that, for example, there are a number of monsters in my story. I didn't actually invent any of them. They're all monsters that are based on local cryptid mythology. Sort of think Bigfoot, except in my case, they're weird monsters in Ohio folklore, which I used. As you may very well know, there is a mythical sea monster. Well, I shouldn't say mythical because I guess it hasn't been disproven. But there is a legendary creature in Chesapeake Bay.
That's right.
Called Chessie. And Chessie shows up in Mountain Folk. I won't tell people how and why, but Chessie ends up being a very important part of the story of Mountain Folk. But again, not something
I think I can probably guess where.
So what I'm intrigued by is not just, again, I love history and depicting historical characters, and I think it's important for young and not so young readers to know their American history. But I'm also fascinated with the folklore aspects, the fantasy aspects, and how they reflect real traditions. What did people think hundreds of years ago about magic, about pixies, about monsters, about things that go bump in the night? So I tried to put all that together.
You did, and you've woven a fantastic tale. It's really interesting. Certainly, the first couple chapters that I've gotten into are wonderful, and this is going to air right before Thanksgiving. So if folks are looking for something to put under the Christmas tree or whatever your holiday tradition is, Mountain Folk is fantastic. Not only because it's a good story, but also because it does draw in these elements of folklore. It does draw in these elements of history, and these are real tales. It's not as if you are creating or making that up. You're just weaving it into a storyline that you have created, which is very interesting. One thing I learned, probably should have known what a Wampus cat was, but the only time I've ever heard it is, "Hey, you're looking all cattywampus." Right. I've heard that term before, but I never knew what a Wampus cat actually is. And so we're introduced to that pretty soon. But just so folks kind of have an idea as to where we're going here or what kind of book this really is, I want to read a quick paragraph from your tale. It says, "Looking past the rhododendron bush and up the cliffside, Goran saw a telltale glow. It was the shimmer, the wall of, am I pronouncing this correct? Magecraft? Or Magicraft. Magecraft.
Yes, Magecraft and Spell Song. Yeah.
So the wall of Magecraft and Spell Song that surrounded the village contained its time and energies and protected it from incursion. Most earthly creatures couldn't see it at all. Magical creatures had no trouble spotting the wall, but couldn't traverse it without voicing or playing the proper musical phrase. Goran approached the shimmer and began humming. He felt the familiar tingle of magic from head to foot. He felt the wall give way, and he pushed through. So this is not a boring, dust off the dusty cobwebs or whatever from a history book and bring it out. I'm going to tell you about the Battle of Yorktown. This is actually a really cool book that weaves in those stories of Daniel Boone and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the like. And so we talked a little bit about, your ideas and kind of how it came to you, but why the supernatural? Why the magical? What was the influence of Tolkien and the like on you creating this book?
Well, there's a lot of theories about fantasy and what role that it plays in our experience. Most human cultures have what we might call something like fantasy literature. Starts out as just people telling stories around the campfire that illustrate some important truth. Of course, it's made up, and even primitive people. We sometimes assume that we're so much smarter than those primitive people. They understood that they were elaborating at least off of some questionable assumptions or something. They were telling stories that conveyed important truths. Some of them were just as simple as, this is the magical reason why you shouldn't go near that cave. Now, actually, it just might be because that's where the cave bears were and you might eat you. But they provided that kind of very practical guidance. But more generally, these stories, which we've been telling ourselves for thousands of years and will be telling ourselves for thousands of years more, speak to some deep truths about the unknown, about the temptations of power, about what it means to be human. A lot of times we learn from speculative fiction about humanity when the fiction itself is actually about non-human characters. But you learn, it's sort of like how many people learned or thought about human nature by watching Spock on Star Trek, who's only half human and leans into his Vulcan side, and so he's not human. And the way he acts actually underlines what it means to be human. So that's what I do in the story, and the clip that you just read illustrates a lot of what's going on. I should say, first of all, just as a framing device, this story, Mountain Folk, is set between 1751 and 1791.
Yep.
Almost all the action happens in an even shorter time frame, just right around the American Revolution period. But there's some stuff that happens in front and a little that happens afterwards. And at that time, the place where Goran, who's one of the main fairy characters that you mentioned a moment ago, when he's going into that shimmer on top of a mountain, that's an actual place. You can visit it. It's called Pilot Mountain. And it's right close to the line between North Carolina and Virginia. And there is a rhododendron bush. And there are legends of fairy creatures that live atop the mountain. I didn't make any of that up either. And that particular description of the shimmer, which you were talking about, that's an important sort of concept or conceit for my entire tale, which is, again, borrowed, not invented. That people in fairy worlds, when you leave the human world and go into fairyland, time passes a lot slower in fairyland. People are familiar with this idea if they've ever heard the story of Rip Van Winkle, which Washington Irving didn't really make up the concept. He wrote the specific story, but the idea was deeply embedded in traditional folklore, actually from around the world, that if human beings could ever intrude into the magical realm, that the magical realm is sort of timeless and time is moving very slowly. And so if you spent a day or a week or a month in the magical world, and then you went back to the real world, it might be many years later. There are even stories in Cherokee folklore about this exact same thing. A warrior would find a sort of a Cherokee version of a mermaid next to a river and fall in love and decide to go with her back to her world and live happily for a while, but then say, I miss my children. And that person leaves the fairy world, goes back into the real world, and finds out the children have long since passed away because time is moving more quickly. Now, this is a fun conceit just to play with as a fantasy tale, and I think I had some fun with it. It's also a way to keep my main characters who are not human, keep them consistent throughout multiple books, even as American history is proceeding, and the second book in the series, Forest Folk, happens during the War of 1812, et cetera, et cetera. So as the human characters change, because we are mortal, the imaginary characters can be sort of places for the reader to stay with, because it's the same people going through the story. But there's an even deeper message here, which has to do with lore itself, a tradition. tradition, in a sense, is that which is unchanging, or at least doesn't change very quickly. And often there is a tension between our desire to hold on to the past and to honor and live by traditions that have proven themselves over time, and new ideas, new innovations, living in a new way. And what I'm depicting in part is, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, from ancient through medieval to early modern period, the fantasy worlds that people imagined, the pixies and the dwarves and the elves and the monsters and so forth, they lived pretty much like the people who were inventing the stories about. So they all had the same kind of technology. They wore the same kind of clothing. But in my story, a lot of these magical creatures and fairies and so forth still kind of look like they're living in the Middle Ages. But the human beings are moving along. They're moving quicker and quicker and quicker towards the Industrial Revolution and beyond. So I think you can see that there is a fun adventure tale part of this time dilation that I lean into. But there's a symbolic aspect, too, that I think will become more obvious as people delve into the story.
So let's talk about the period of time that you chose. It's very interesting to me that you chose the Revolutionary War period to do this, and Daniel Boone and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, Alexander Hamilton as characters within the book. What was attractive about the Revolution to, making it your initial setting for your first book?
Well, there are, I guess, three reasons why I chose the Revolutionary period. The first one is I like it. The truth is that if authors do something more than write a story that the author himself would enjoy if he was the reader, then you're making a mistake. So I wrote the kind of book I would enjoy reading. Now, I hope other people enjoy reading it too.
Of course.
But I would love to read. I would have loved to have read a story about the Revolutionary War that had some magical elements to it. So that's what I did. I liked it. But the other reasons are, first, that we simply need to understand the origins of America a little better. And yes, part of what I'm doing here is making for young and grown readers alike. This book's appropriate for teens and maybe precocious tweens. It's not a children's book, but it's certainly appropriate for a teenager or an adult to read. Trying to make it more accessible for people who may not know a lot about the Revolutionary period to learn about it. So I know this sounds a little odd for people who are still wrapping their heads around the idea of historical fantasy, but much of this book is scrupulously accurate to the point that I don't even place characters, historical real-life people, in the same location at the same time unless I'm fairly confident they were together, or at least could have been together. And I try to describe the battles of the Revolutionary War with a fair amount of, not to get into like huge detail, but to describe them accurately. And, I've been to these locations and I've walked around and figured out, can you run along this river? Is this slope too high or too low or something like that? So I've tried to make it have what is called verisimilitude, which is basically have it feel a lot like real life, even though there's fantasy to it. And part of what I do is I actually use both my real life characters and my fantasy characters to explore the ideas behind the revolution. I won't give too much of the plot away, but
right.
There is a vigorous debate among the wee folk, the magical creatures who live in America, who have immigrated to America, some of them from Europe, about whether they should intervene on behalf of American colonies resisting British tyranny, or whether they should intervene on behalf of Britain. And what I do there is I use a lot of the ideas, a lot of the debates that actually happened between Americans, among Americans and, among patriots and Tories. And I simply do that, but using these other characters. And quite literally, I went in and pulled pamphlets that were written, the Thomas Paine pamphlets, as well as the Tory pamphlets that were written in response to Thomas Paine. And I used direct quotes from the pamphlets. I changed them slightly and put them in the mouths of somebody else. So some of this is about giving people a sense of really what the revolution may have been about and what it would have felt like to be on one side or the other of the revolution. The third reason, and I alluded to this earlier, is part of my larger purpose in Mountain Folk and what I hope to be a number of books in the folklore cycle that I'm writing is to depict this tension between tradition and innovation, between deference to authority and freedom. And there's a tension. I mean, we can respect that tradition has value and that new ideas have value, and that it's sort of a hard thing to figure out what the balance is. And America typifies this better than any country's history in the history of our world, which is that it is, in some ways, America was a brand new thing. Certainly the American constitutional government that was concocted a few years after the Revolution didn't really exist in any form before that moment. So that was something very new. And building what I would describe as a classical liberal republic from the sort of ground up was a revolutionary act. And as John Adams argued, the American Revolution was not won on the battlefield, it was won in the mind. American Revolution was won before Yorktown. I mean, the war was clinched at Yorktown. But the revolution was philosophical and even religious or moral, you might think. So that's why I chose the Revolution period for my first book. And as we go through subsequent books, what I hope to do is illustrate further this idea of America's growing, it's changing. Different kinds of people are becoming Americans, having previously not been thought of as Americans or not thinking of themselves as Americans. And what does that mean? What does it mean to have a common heritage and be part of a common culture, even though you may look very different? You may speak very differently. You may worship very differently. Your origin story getting to America may be very different, sometimes exhilarating, sometimes tragic. And that's what I did, and that's why I chose it. It seemed like the logical place to start if that's the sort of long arc of story that I'm planning to tell.
Excellent. Well, many of my listeners are located here in Virginia, and Virginia plays, I wouldn't necessarily say a central role, but a large role in this tale, whether we're talking about Pastor Muhlenberg is involved in this. We already mentioned Yorktown, Shenandoah Valley, Daniel Boone and his immigration from Pennsylvania through Virginia to North Carolina. Why Virginia? Obviously, the Battle of Yorktown is key, and it's important to winning the Revolution. And two key figures, Washington and Jefferson, are certainly from here. But, talk a little bit about that Virginia connection.
Well, there's a lot of reasons why Virginia was such a representative place. Arguably, Pennsylvania would be the only other province, as it was called before the Revolution. They actually weren't called colonies. It would be the province of Pennsylvania. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was a later concept. But the idea that Pennsylvania, and in particular Virginia, represented the rather different experiences that people were having. The colonists who settled the Shenandoah Valley, including one of my main characters, you mentioned Peter Muhlenberg, who is from a German family in Pennsylvania. He's typical. Daniel Boone is typical. Central and Western Virginia was not settled primarily from the coast. It was settled from the north. So people were landing, immigrants, Scotch-Irish immigrants, German immigrants, were landing in Philadelphia or Newcastle, Delaware. They would live in that area for a brief time, maybe a generation. Then they would move, their ancestors or their descendants would move west, pushed by the next wave of immigrants. By the time he got into middle to western Pennsylvania, the idea began to go down through the mountain valleys along the east slopes of the Appalachian Mountains, ending up in the Carolinas and actually Georgia. And Virginia is sort of the pipeline for all that. And lots of people didn't go all the way to the Carolinas and Georgia. They stopped in the Shenandoah Valley and other parts of central and western Virginia. So I'm telling that story, but I'm also telling the role that Norfolk and the people who lived in the Hampton Roads area played in the Revolutionary period, because it's important and different. And yes, Daniel Boone, we often think of as, well, he's not a Virginia guy. He grew up in Pennsylvania, and then he lived in North Carolina, and then he went to Kentucky. Well, that's a thumbnail sketch at best of a more interesting fellow. And we got to remember, and I know you know this, but he lived in Kentucky off and on and helped to open up Kentucky to settlement, and he even lived in West Virginia for a while. Well, that's all Virginia.
It is.
At this time, that's just all Virginia. Just that's like right. When I have a number of the Cherokee characters in my story, I depict the Cherokee world quite a bit in Mountain Folk. That's occurring in what is now Tennessee, primarily, But at the time, it was just North Carolina. It was just the western provinces of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So Virginia, particularly if you include West Virginia, which there's a chapter also set in West Virginia at Point Pleasant, that's also Virginia. And what it reflects is this Virginia was this country, in a sense. It wasn't heavily populated, but this sort of country into itself that had the plantation culture and even a maritime commercial culture on the coast. And then inland had a different kind of plantation culture on the rivers, typified by Richmond and other settlements. And then as you went further west, became more like central and western Carolina, which was really small farmers, not a whole lot of plantation economy, but small farms, a lot of conversion of the grains that they grew and even the fruit that they grew to something that was storable and transferable, i.e. alcohol, a big part of the story. So that's why I chose Virginia. And it is a rich place to tell lots of different kinds of stories, particularly in the 1700s, which is where this story is based. And as I began to populate my real world, my real 1700s colonial America with fairy nations, which is part of the idea, one of the logical places to put a more urban, it's kind of a strong word for Norfolk at this time, but to put a more town-oriented fairy group, which would be the Pixies, they live in Norfolk. They live in it. And I won't tell you exactly where because it's more fun if you don't know. But they live in the vicinity of Norfolk, and there's another colony of fairy beings who live in the Shenandoah Valley in the middle of in a mountain. And once again, this is somewhat based on the idea that the Pixies came from West England. There were lots of settlers later in the Hampton Roads period that came from the western part of England and Cornwall. And so I tried to connect some of these fairy peoples, their national origins, with the immigrants. Mm-hmm. So that immigrant population of Germans that moved into the Shenandoah Valley, of which Peter Muhlenberg is one of the more famous examples, one of George Washington's generals. Mm-hmm. Muhlenberg and company move into Shenandoah Valley, and they're bringing their German folkways, their German customs. So why wouldn't there be fairy creatures from Germany? Well, in fact, in my story, there are.
That's awesome. You know, one thing that a lot of folks might not be aware of, I'll kind of tangentially go off on this topic for a second, but Norfolk did play a critical role in the colonies eventually declaring their independence. For those who weren't aware, what happened was Lord Dunmore sailed his Ethiopian regiment into North Carolina and attempted to come up to get Norfolk under control through what is now Chesapeake at the Battle of Great Bridge in December of 1775. That regiment was repelled, and what Lord Dunmore did in retaliation is actually bomb the city of Norfolk by sea, with his ships. In fact, you can still see a cannonball wedged into St. Paul's Church in downtown Norfolk today from that bombardment. That was what assisted the government of Virginia at the time and the House delegates and the like to say to the Continental Congress, yes, indeed, we will come along for the ride and declare this independence from Great Britain. So there's history all over the place around here, and having your Pixies or fairies settle in Norfolk is very prescient and important for sure.
And of course, that tale you just told is important because the existence of that Ethiopian regiment from Lord Dunmore and his declaration has become somewhat controversial lately because some have argued that Virginians, at least, or other people who lived where there were slaves, actually declared their independence from Great Britain simply to defend the institution of slavery. And that mixes up the timeline quite a bit. And you did a good job of describing the fact that there was already a war. There was already, for years before, there was agitation about what they considered to be a lack of representation in the British government that was telling them what to do, and British encroachments on traditional freedoms. And after it became clear, and after there were declarations, and after there were militia called out and so forth, then Dunmore, as a war measure, attempted to disrupt
Right.
this institution of slavery. And there were slaves that were liberated during that period, by the way. And it's all a very fascinating story. But you get your causality all mixed up if you think that something that happened at the end of 1775 caused something that happened in 1774.
Right. Exactly. For sure. It is November, which means that it is Native American History Month, as has been declared. There is a lot of Native American traditions that you also explore in the book. Why was that important that you included that as part of the storyline?
Well, the relationship between American colonists and the British forces, British government, and Native American nations, from the Iroquois nations of the northern colonies to the Cherokee, for example, who play a significant role in my tale. This is a really, really important part of understanding that period, understanding what the British thought they were doing, what the Americans were hoping they could accomplish. Even the strategy of the Revolutionary War on the part of Britain relied heavily on at least distractions, diversionary tactics from their British allied Indian tribes like the Cherokee or parts of the Cherokee. And so I thought it was important just to depict the Revolutionary period accurately. But to my broader purpose of combining history and fantasy, the truth is fantasy is largely if you think about all kinds of fantasy, Tolkien and his kind of what's called high fantasy, which is technically not happening in our world, happening in some other parallel universe called Middle Earth, but is always really informed by old ancient traditions about, for example, elves and dwarves and dragons. I mean, Tolkien was a Beowulf scholar, and he drew heavily from real legends of Norse and Germanic and Icelandic and so forth origins. Well, I'm going to tell a story about I'm going to tell a fantasy story set in early America. I can't just borrow a few monsters who, hightail it over from France. And so actually the Native American traditions about fairies, and they had lots of fairy traditions in Native American culture, pretty much, except for the American Southwest, which is a little different. I'm going to treat that in a subsequent book. But in most parts of North America and Central America, there were fairy legends, just as there are fairy legends in Africa, which I play with a little bit too. In the case of the Cherokee fairies, there are actually several different fairy groups. And the two that I chose to zero in on are called the Nunnahi and the Yunwi-Junsti. And the Nunnahi you might think of as sort of equivalent to elves in a Tolkien sense. They tend to be, they live in high places. They tend to be associated with helping, with learning, with traditions and rituals and ceremonies. And they were often sort of spiritual allies of the Cherokee people against the enemies of the Cherokee. And the Yunwi-Junsti, we might think more like dwarves or imps or something, a little bit. That term simply means little people in Cherokee. And it was more like the people who might be mischievous, might live in a mound under the earth, might live in a hill. And so I use both of those peoples and lots of other peoples from around the Native American world. And I use monsters. Cherokee monsters show up several times here. The key one there is an early chapter that you may not have gotten to yet, but you'll enjoy. An encounter with a famous Cherokee monster called a Stoneclad. And these existed throughout most Indian. The Iroquois called them stonecoats. It's the same idea. It's basically a stone giant, a rock giant. It's like a big giant that's made out of rock. And so if you're going to populate, as I said, a fantasy story with this sense of long eon back sort of legendary moments, creatures, places, and you can do it in America, then you can't just use Welsh mythology because, contrary to popular belief, the Welsh did not arrive in America in 1100, as some claim. So we got to stick with the Native American traditions, which are rich and evocative and were lots of fun to include.
That's excellent. So One thing that we alluded to earlier is one of the purposes of this book is to make sure that there is historical accuracy, historical fact that's included in it, and that people can do their research and find out more about these stories. That probably in today's day and age can receive a little bit of criticism and pushback. Have you received criticism and pushback for, showing Washington and Jefferson perhaps as heroes, and then some of the other ideas and concepts in your book?
Why, yes, I have. And I expected some. We're in a particular moment in time, as I don't have to tell you and your audience, because you already know this. We're at a moment in time where there have been, particularly in the last year and a half, been substantial efforts to yank American heroes off of the pedestals that we've placed them on. And I mean figuratively, but sometimes literally, sometimes actually yanking statues down.
Absolutely.
But figuratively, cutting them all down to size. George Washington wasn't so hot because he did these horrible things. And he freed some of his slaves at death, but he should have freed them earlier. And look at all what happened to the Indian villages and this, that. And, some of this is, the old story that that which is new is not true, and that which is true is not new. That's how I feel like about this sort of revisionism wave that we're experiencing from the 1619 Project type of work all the way through to these protest movements, is that some of what they're saying is absolutely the case and has been observed for generations. I mean, people commented about George Washington and his relationship to the Iroquois and other Indian nations, in the 1800s. This was a real live controversy, or at least conversation about the founding period and how they acted. I pulled not too long ago a textbook off my shelf from the 1950s. It was a textbook, History of North Carolina. And, its treatment of race was problematic. And that's not going to shock anybody. It was the 1950s. But their treatment of the Trail of Tears was remarkably similar to the way we understand it today. It was condemning of Americans' decisions there. It depicted the tragic consequences of the Trail of Tears. So a lot of these revisionist ideas that we have about people like Jefferson are not really new. Mm-hmm. The other part of it, though, that is new is not true. So we don't want to say because a particular person like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington owned slaves, that therefore they are not heroes in any shape or form, because that's not how human life works. That's not how human history works. You just simply can't find very many people who do admirable things who haven't already also done something that is less than admirable or even really bad. And Absolutely. It also takes out of context the problem of abolition, which all of the individuals that I mentioned struggled with, including Jefferson. You can, of course, see in his early life that he sort of burned with an intense dislike of slavery. And people say, well, then he was a hypocrite because he didn't do anything. And I'm willing to grant he was a hypocrite in some ways. But the problem of being a slave owner who may have wanted to liberate slaves, but also being in debt, needs to be better understood. If Jefferson had actually sort of attempted with a stroke of his pen to liberate all of his slaves, during most of his lifetime, he was so heavily in debt that was an illegal act. Even when it was legal to emancipate slaves in Virginia, which it was for a time, it would have been illegal for him to do so because he was in debt. So his creditors would have simply reclaimed the slaves. They would have been re-enslaved, and he would have been thrown in debtor's prison, or something bad would have happened to him. So I'm not saying that he was a heroic figure on slavery. He was not. I think he articulated ideals he didn't live up to. But when we don't think about the context in which we're understanding these historical characters, we miss something significant. So I've been trying to make this argument to readers. I think most of the readers enjoyed it, but some non-readers read descriptions of the book and got really mad and called me names. And one former editor of mine said that I was an un-American bigot. Yep. Because I didn't want to displace Washington and Jefferson from the from the ranks of American heroes. My point to her and to others is we can understand the flaws of these people, even though we recognize they did some fabulous things to create America as we understand it today. We can understand that the thing to do is not to tear down, it's to add to. It's to add additional heroes to the pantheon. There's lots of room for people to learn a lot more about your heroes like Sojourner Truth, who was a character in my upcoming novel, Forest Folk. Sojourner Truth is a fantastic American character, American hero. And that's one of the things, even the term I just used is important. We don't say someone is a hero to Black Americans or a hero to Hispanic Americans or a hero to women. Susan B. Anthony is not simply a hero to women. Susan B. Anthony is an American hero for everybody.
Right.
And if we hold up heroes, recognizing that they're flawed creatures, that they make mistakes. Susan B. Anthony was a flawed creature. Sojourner Truth was a flawed creature. But we hold these people up for what they did that is admirable. And that what they did that is admirable is part of our common heritage as Americans. It doesn't matter what color we are, what gender, sex we are, what our religious beliefs are. We can embrace the heroism in all of these people. And in fact, I think we need more heroes, not fewer, to bring our country together in this rather divided time.
Absolutely. And I think an important point to consider is by not having them as heroes, you cannot talk about their flaws. And by not talking about their flaws, then we can't learn from it. So I think that's an important point for us to continue to consider. But it's not all criticism. There is a lot of fun that you are having with this book. And I do want to talk about your videos and your travels. That's just got to be a great joy with the process of making these books. Talk a little bit about the videos that you did to try to promote the book and, your continued travels to research your upcoming books.
Well, I wish this was an elaborately planned out marketing strategy, but what I realized as I was researching and finishing the book, the first book, Mountain Folk, as I said earlier, my research includes going to the actual locations where the story is set, if I can, and actually see if my action will work. I mean, I had one action scene planned out that involved some people running up a mountain. And when I went to the mountain and looked at the slope, I realized I can't even run up the hill, and I'm not wearing equipment, and I'm not carrying a musket or a rifle. And so I had to change the action because it just what didn't work. So as I went to these locations the first couple of times, I realized, why don't I just shoot some video? I'm already going to these locations. I should shoot some video and explain why I'm at a particular location and what the significance of that location is. And that broadened out to have an idea. What I should do is do a series of short 2, 3, 3.5 minute videos that explain different themes and characters and setting of Mountain Folk. And to do those by going to the locations or sometimes locations similar. If it's really far away and it really wasn't practical, I would go to a similar location that was closer to home and use it as a backdrop. So I enjoyed going to historic sites and the tops of mountains. And I did my first video is shot next to a flowing river. You can hear the water flowing as I'm talking about the mermaid legends that I include actually in a side story to Mountain Folk called The Bard. But the mermaids are part of the story. And so going to these places and shooting these videos was a wonderful sort of 2-for-1 shot, because I was often going to go to these places anyway just to investigate them as historically accurate in the way I depict them in the book. And also what I've learned is people like watching videos. I know this is kind of shocking, particularly since I spent about a quarter of a century in television myself. Should have fully appreciated just how much people like to watch, particularly shorter videos to allow them to get a flavor of something. And so that's what I did. You can watch the whole thing and it's like a half-hour documentary, but that's not the way I structured it. I structured it as a series of 10 episodes, and I think people enjoyed it in that form.
That's fantastic. Well, John Hood, thank you so much for being on the show and talking about your book, Mountain Folk. Where can folks find out more about you and the book?
Well, I kept it simple. Put pretty much everything you could ever want to know at mountainfolkbook.com. From there, you can jump off. There are buying options on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and the usual places. But there's also lots of the full 10-episode video series is there. I even made a series of character miniatures, which you can see a gallery of all the different characters. I have a map. I have lots of press coverage and reviews and other material about the book. I think people will enjoy just learning about how I came to write this book and how I researched it and how I put it together. And all of that, including ways to order the book, can be found at mountainfolkbook.com.
Awesome. And John, when can we expect to see Forest Folk out from the publisher?
Forest Folk will be coming out in April of 2022, so not too far away. And absolutely, I think you'll love Forest Folk, but you have to read Mountain Folk first. It's a prerequisite for the course.
There you go. John Hood, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
Really appreciate John Hood coming on the program today to talk about his book, Mountain Folk. You can find out more about his book and how to get it at mountainfolkbook.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, please review it, and please share it with others. That's a great way to spread the word. And of course, let others know about some of the great content that you heard here today and maybe in other podcasts. So until next time, I'm your host, J.R. Heff. Take care.